There you got it.
Yep.
Perfect. All right.
All right, so we're now recording it. Welcome to the third committee meeting of the Bylaws Committee of EGPOA, everybody. So as I indicated to everyone before we started that hopefully we will have a relatively short meeting. We do have one bylaws language proposal that Robert and some others have been working on. This is in follow-up to a concept we were talking about for a couple of meetings now, and that's really, you know, the function of the bylaws committee and how it is something a little different than maybe some of the other standing committees of the board, and how we want to try to build in some continuity. So those who've been looking at the issue have proposed some language. And then second on our agenda is just a quick update on a couple of other initiatives following up from our last meeting. And then I wanted to open it up and see if anybody else had any questions or anything that you want to talk about. But first, I want to turn it over to Robert and Yakov, and I think Scott had some help. He's shaking his head a little. Helped in putting this other piece together. So Robert, why don't you kick us off? Hate to do this first time in 2023. You are muted.
Okay.
There we
So
go.
I don't know if everyone has a copy of what I sent. What I sent was a second or third draft of just an idea in order to get it to you folks, so that you could look at it and think about it and read it and think as to whether or not it makes sense. To what extent do you think it doesn't make sense? And to talk about it. It's a discussion proposal. It is a running it up the flagpole to see who salutes it kind of a thing. So if you want, I'll just run through it and tell you a little bit about why it says what it says.
Robert, if I can just quickly interrupt for 1 second,
Sure.
Acknowledging that I didn't send it out to the rest of the bylaws committee until just a few moments ago.
So no one's seen it, just Leslie?
Yeah, well, everyone's got it now.
Got it.
But you know, we've only had a few minutes to look at it. So what I was going to suggest is that I could share it to the screen as you walk through it.
Okay.
Much as I'm sure you guys want to see my motion that I'm working on. Let me show this. Okay. Can everybody see this? Bylaws committee?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay. So the first sentence just states what the name of the committee is, that it's a standing committee, and what it is supposed to do. And the 1 and 2 could be 3 and 4, but the thought was that it should, we're talking about interpretation and drafting, and that was enough to leave it that way, because we would be proposing revisions from time to time, and we would be interpreting what it was, and that is what the bylaws committee's main function would be. And then the second sentence makes it clear that it is the board which will determine whether any changes would be submitted to the membership for approval, because the membership has to approve a bylaw change by a vote. And in the past, bylaw changes have been submitted to the membership it is sometimes in advance of an annual meeting, or sometimes along with the announcement of an annual meeting with some kind of an explanation. I myself, when thought that it was much better to have an advanced meeting, these little ad hoc meetings that we've seen, pop-up meetings, I guess they'd be called today. Pop-up meetings where people could come and hear why the bylaws are being changed, any questions that they have, give the membership the opportunity to hear the explanation before they're asked to vote on it. Because certainly in the last couple of years, the board had just sent out revisions in the bylaws and said, vote or don't vote. And that's not, in my view, that's not that, it's not that great a way to do it. It was much fairer, I think, when the bylaws committee would report to the members and explain why it was done the way it was done and what it was for, what the purpose was, and that made for a more intelligent vote. But that'll be up, it's up to the board to determine what that process would be. And it's up to the board certainly to determine which proposals will go out to the membership. It wasn't, I thought, for this particular section of the bylaws, it wasn't for the bylaws committee to make a determination as to how a proposed bylaw change might be presented to the members. That's for the board to determine. So then the second paragraph, says that the bylaws shall have up to 9 members. It was up to 9 members rather than saying 9 members, because you never know whether you're going to have that many people interested in it. Right now, we do have that many people interested in it, and perhaps more, but in the past that hasn't been the case. So the feeling was 9 is a good number. It could be 11, it could be 7. That's that's up to us to decide what the number will be. We're just putting out there the fact that it would be up to 9, and it says that 3 of the board members will be members of 3 of the committee members will be members of the board, giving the committee a nice sense of not being necessarily an arm of the board, so that 2/3 of the committee would be non-board members, 1/3 of the committee would be board members. That's a number that could change. It's not written in stone at all. In fact, it's just written in sort of pencil here, and anybody can suggest any changes that they want to. But that one of the members of the board will be the then current president of the board, who will be there, and 2 other members of the board, which I suppose the president would appoint. It's up to him, and it's up to the board to remove and replace any of their members at any time. But the non-board members would have a fixed term, and that term would be staggered, and they and there is a I guess what you'd call a precatory, in the law you might call it a precatory request that it contain, that it shall include the non-board members, professionals who have had experience with bylaws and contracts, either professionally or in the context of personal experiences. So it doesn't have to be lawyers. It just has to be people who have had some experience during the course of their lives with bylaws, and with the way bylaws operate, and with the difficulties that that come up in connection with bylaws, so that the committee would have some, you know, some people with some experience working with bylaws. And the last section only talks about vacancies on the board, how they would be filled, and the manner in which you would get your staggered terms, so that you would be able to have a continuous membership on this board. That's it. It's a pretty simple bylaw.
Okay. So, have questions for Robert?
Yeah, I want to know, can you, Robert, clarify the wording that says, or in the content of personal experiences?
Well, it shouldn't say context. I think that's a typo. It says it should be in the context of personal experiences. And in the context of personal experiences means if you had served on a board at some point, and you had experience with bylaws and reading them and interpreting them, and some of the problems that occur in connection with a board, that would be a personal experience. That's not necessarily a professional experience. That's just, I've done it before, and I know, and I've had some experience doing it. That's what I mean by in the context of personal experiences. Professional experiences means you've dealt with it as an accountant, or as a lawyer, or as, or whatever. A personal experience is not in connection with what you do for a living.
Dan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, so as far as that sentence go, paragraph 2, sentence 3, I feel like it would be better suited for us to omit that sentence as a whole. It's my understanding that something like that would be definitely swayed to interpretation, and could misrepresent the people that were willing to step up and be appointed to a board. I don't want to exclude specific people, and I specifically don't want to make it difficult for some members to join the board or join the committee, because they may not have that qualification that you've put in there. I feel that it would be better if we just omit that sentence as a whole. It would be in the best interest of the board or other members of the committee to determine those qualifications at the time of selecting the members for that committee, I feel. Then putting a broad brush out there, you must meet these requirements, because it could be misrepresented, and it could definitely open us up to maybe somebody wants to interpret that a different way. Well, you haven't had this, but you've had that. I just feel that it could definitely give us a inaccurate representation of the people that we want on the committee.
I really disagree with that wholeheartedly, because the language says shall include, but shall not be limited to. And that means that you're going to want to look for people who have some experience. But once you have found one or two people who have had some experience, you're not limited to those people. Anybody can be on the board. And this is pretty clear, that to say shall not be limited to professionals who have had experience and contracts, either professionally or in the context of personal experiences. So any professional person who's had experience would qualify, and anyone else
No,
would qualify.
Certainly, I understand, the mechanics behind it and why you're including that. I guess my question would be, would that sentence have the ability to exclude people from the committee?
I don't think anybody could be excluded on a shall include but not be limited to. Once you say not limited to, it's not limited to those
No,
people.
I understand. I just want to make it, if it's at all possible, that we don't exclude anyone.
Dan, I think it's more presenting to the community what type of people we would want on this committee, and I don't know what type of people, but what background people ought to have to be on this committee. That's all I think it's saying. And again,
No, I fully get that. I just worry that the interpretation down the line, let's just say all of us are gone down the line, and then there's another group that's appointing people to the committee, that could misrepresent the people that we're trying to put on there. I would prefer we not put anything to exclude people, that's all.
I hear Dan's point, if I can jump in. I think a way to maybe massage that language a little bit is to unlawyer it and, you know, say that what we're really saying is this is the suggested criteria for what the non-board member might look like in terms of their experience levels. And I think there's a way to sort of play with that a little bit that's not terribly different than the sentence that's written there. Shall include but not be limited to might be a little too legalese, and Dan's point might turn some folks off. And there may be a sort of plain English way to put it that's, you know, it encourages the non-board members have this particular experience or skill set, but that's not a requirement.
And I don't disagree with, you know, again, the mechanics behind it. And it's clear that you guys put a lot of thought into this. And I first want to say thank you. I mean, this is fantastic. So you did a phenomenal job. I just worry that somewhere it could be used as a device to exclude people. That's all. That's all I wanted to say.
So we can work on that a little bit, perhaps. Earl, I see you have your hand. Thanks, Dan. Earl, I see you have your hand up.
Dan hit it. I mean, this isn't a legal document. I understand we have some pretty smart attorneys on, but perception's reality. I think Dan hit the spot on. And at the end of the day, if anyone wants to serve on this committee, there'll be some minimal requirements, but professional experience is based off of whom's interpretation. I mean, we can use that, and the people who are determining those persons that will be participatory, they can craft that. I wholeheartedly, though I understand the purpose and the intent, I'm uncomfortable with that statement. And I look at contracts every day.
So let me ask this, Robert, and those who are working on this. One thing that I just sort of think about practically and looking at this language is, how do the appointments occur? Like who's responsible for them? I don't think this is super clear on that point. So as our bylaws exist right now, committee members are appointed by the president, but that seems sort of overly centralized. And I think there's maybe a way we can say that the board would appoint, but maybe to my question and to the point that Earl and Dan are raising, we can make it clearer that there's an appointment process and this is what the board should look for. Does that make sense?
You would prefer language that says the board should look for, and then put in this thing. I think that's more limited. I think that's more limiting than saying that the non-board members shall include but not be limited to.
Okay, so let me take it back.
You're directing what the board should look for. Then I think that's more limiting than the other.
So let me take it back a step then. If we left that language as is, I'm not clear reading this how the non-board members, whether they shall include and not be limited to these particular classes of folks, how do they get on the committee? Do they submit their names? Are they appointed by the board? Are they appointed by the president? Are they elected?
Patrick, I think I can, if I can speak, I think I can answer that. If you look at the last paragraph, so what it says is that the initial non-board members are appointed by the board.
Right.
And then what it says is that when there are vacancies among the non-board members, which would happen either at the end of the term of a board member, of a committee member, I'm sorry, or if a committee member resigned earlier, if those vacancies, if for any reason a vacancy is created, the vacancy is filled, it says, by the board. So the initial appointment of the members of the committee is being done by, this is suggested here to be done by the board, and any vacancies that occur either at the end of the person's term or at the, or if a person resigns from the committee early, those vacancies would be filled by the board as well.
Or moves away or sells or whatever.
Right, whatever the reason, right. So that is handled by the board. And so it's going to be the board that's going to make the decision who meets the qualifications,
Okay.
you know, whether they're satisfied when they propose a person.
All right, thanks, Jakob, that makes sense. And then that's consistent with the existing provisions of the bylaws, so there's not a need to make further amendments. And then I think coming back then to the point Dan and Or were making, maybe we can soften that language a little bit so that it's, you know, I get the point of the drafters here, that it's, you know, you want to you want people with this kind of experience to really be involved here, but I also understand the point about not excluding anyone who wants to volunteer, which we've seen as a
Sure,
board.
but just remember that the bylaws committee is a little different from the other committees. The bylaws committee is dealing with bylaws, which is which is essentially the governing document for this organization. It's the governing document. It's not like it's not even like rules. The bylaws can only be amended by a vote of the membership, and I would think that any organization would want a bylaws committee that has some experience with drafting and interpreting legal language, because the bylaws are legal language. You violate the bylaws and you're in trouble. I don't understand. I mean, I understand why you might want some people who have no experience with bylaws, because maybe they think a different way, and you want someone on the board who has never seen a legal document in his or her life and doesn't know how to read it, and maybe just feels these kinds of things. Maybe that would be a good member. I don't know. I've never worked with anyone like that, but I really think that the language is very inclusive. It is not non-inclusive. If you want to soften that language, by all means do it. I mean, I have no problem with it. I don't see the problem.
All right, well, I'm just suggesting a potential compromise. Earl, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, whatever. I trust you, Patrick. So at the end of the day, my sister's an attorney. There's language that can be done from a legal perspective, and there is language that can be done from a layman's perspective that conveys the same points. It's no different than our finance board. So are we suggesting that anyone who participates or is involved in our finance board, they need to have some type of financial or fiscal experience, either on the 9 to 5 or within their own personal life and experience? But the other thing of it is that, but if the board members that are selected, the non-board members that are selected by initially the board, then they already have an assessment and auditing criterion anyway. Because the board is tasked with the responsibility to say, hey, we need to make sure that the folks that are going to be driving the thought leadership for this particular committee need to have these core tenets. The board, and that should be paramount. I don't know why it needs to be included in the document, in this particular document, top of the line.
So if I can offer sort of a more innocent explanation, I think it's just that it's meant to depoliticize it, because this committee can become overly politicized, right? And I think that if I'm guessing, and I wasn't involved in this the drafting of this, that it was an effort to depoliticize it a little bit. But I don't. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Earl, but I'm going to go to Scott and then Dan.
Sure, just one.
Oh. Scott, I accidentally muted you. That was on me.
That's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah.
I think I think the purpose of the language is nothing more than it's just a guide. These are the types of people that we believe ought to serve on this committee. Now, really what it comes down to, which you mentioned, Patrick, you felt that you have, as the president, could really appoint committee members. Just reading the bylaws, this might be something that we want to clean up a bit, because it seems that in Article 8, you can appoint the chair of each committee. And then thereafter, it says additional committee members shall be appointed or removed by the president from among the members in good standing, subject to review and approval by the board of directors. So it sounds like you maybe are allowed to nominate someone, but at the end of the day, the whole board has to approve or disapprove a recommendation to be on a committee. I don't know if.
I mean, that's how this board is operated.
Well, you know, I would just suggest, can I just suggest a few, just, a couple of other thoughts maybe for people, or for Earl and, perhaps others to think about as well. First of all, there, as we said, the decision who goes on the board, who goes on the committee, I'm sorry, is left to the board members. And this, I think the language here is intended to provide a guideline, which to take Bob's point, is that this is supposed to be something of a unique committee. It's a professional committee, and it's supposed to be trying to give, in some ways, legal advice to the board. And I think the purpose of it, Patrick, I think you're right. It's to depoliticize the thing, but also, frankly, it's to protect the board, because, I think we came in the past close a number of times to facing situations where members were almost ready to go to the courts to challenge the board's interpretation of the bylaws. And this is, I think, intended to create a committee that in some ways, provides armor for the board or protection for the board, because there is another body out there that is, comprised of, people, a broader segment of the community, presumably depoliticized, with a professional bent, not exclusively, but a professional bent. And so that, when they therefore support the board, let's say in an interpretation of the bylaws, the likelihood that somebody could prevail in a court challenge would be much reduced. So I think that's really what the benefit of this is. And frankly, I think that's why this committee is a little bit different, Earl, than the finance committee. I do think that you would want to have financially knowledgeable people on the finance committee. Again, not necessarily exclusively, but people who are professionally knowledgeable about financial matters or have experience in financial matters. Yeah, I think we would do better if we had those kind of people on the committee, not exclusively perhaps, but we would do better if they were on the committee. So I think that I think that that's what really this is all about. This is just trying to recognize that this committee is there to help provide a special role for, or a certain level of, if you will, legal accommodation, legal protection for the board. And that's, that's the purpose of it, why it should perhaps be treated a little bit differently than just a welcoming committee, let's say, something of that kind. It is meant to be different.
And our welcoming committee is probably more important than all of them. Just kidding. Dan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, so again, I just want to refer back. If we're going to create a prerequisite for the position, then we're kind of taking out the whole point in the board and possibly the president and the committee just seeking out specific people. When we were creating this committee here, there was people that were seeking members out that would have some of the background experience to work on this board. So again, I don't see the point in including something where we already have a president appointed to the board or to the member of the committee. So I don't really see the point in including that. And we have, as far as legal advice goes, we do pay a pretty penny for having a lawyer on task with any legality issues we may already have. Everything we do, we bounce through legal already. So at that point, we're just, you know, overbearingly legal, the committee. I don't see the point in really keeping to that task of very specific backgrounds, very specific. Again, I'm not saying that I don't understand the reason why. I understand it's a by law committee, but as the president is the head of the committee, and this specific president already has legal experience, and we have a legal team, I don't necessarily see why we would remove or possibly omit members from the committee if they want to volunteer, if we already have that legal background there already.
Well, I wouldn't draft any language like this that lives forever based on any particular office holder. But I want to see if we can't try to find a way to build some consensus around how to move forward on it. If folks are amenable, I might take a stab at just amending that sentence slightly to make it clearer that that is a non-exclusive wish list, but something like that, hope of what the non-board member appointees would look like from their experience level. But again, making it very clear that that's not exclusive, and we want everyone to volunteer who thinks that they have something to offer. And if everyone's okay with that, I would propose that I take a whack at amending that sentence, and then by email submitting that to everybody, and then we can take the vote at our next regularly scheduled meeting, or if anyone thinks it's urgent, we can schedule a special meeting in the interim to try to resolve that. Does that sound fair?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, even if we don't want to fully omit it and we want to just say, we do not want to.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. I'm saying amend it. I'm saying keep it there, but let's work with the language a little bit.
Yeah, maybe change the word experience to knowledge. You know, it's a little bit more, I mean, you're looking for experience, expertise, and then you change it to maybe have some knowledge of this. It's a little bit more softer than asking for an expert.
Right. I think, by the way, this is a really great initiative. And I don't want to let the perfect become the enemy of the good. So if we can find consensus in this one sentence, I think then the rest of it is something that it sounds like everybody, has some agreement around. I for one, really think this is a brilliant idea, because it saw and could serve as a model for other committees if they're if they become as equally important to the living body of the organization. But I think it's very helpful to a board coming in like we were, just sort of bewildered when a lot of other issues going on, to have this sort of system already in place. I think it would help out a lot. So again, thanks to Robert and to Yakov and to Scott and those who worked on it. I think it's helpful. Are there any other questions or points or items?
Again,
you guys want to
I wholeheartedly appreciate what Robert and looks like possibly Scott put together here. So they did a fantastic job, and I thank you guys for stepping up and really trying to help streamline the process for the committee. So great job.
Now, this document, explaining what the bylaw committee is, will it be included in the whole bylaws document? Only because, and I've seen it in another community that I belong to, that each committee had their description, what they were supposed to do in the bylaws. We have the president description, we have the vice presidents, we have the treasurer, and we have the secretary. But when it comes to committees, there isn't anything there in the bylaws that I saw just now that gives an explanation what committee, function is. So my question is, will this document, once approved, will it be part of the bylaws itself, not a standalone document?
Robert, I'll defer to you, but I think I know the answer. You explain.
Yeah, me? Yes, this would be part of the bylaws. And what I wanted to say before was that, remember that this board that we have now is not the board that we're going to have 5 years from now. And certainly it's not the board that we had 2 years ago. And the boards change. The boards change much more frequently than the bylaws are supposed to change. The bylaws are your constitution, and the bylaws are supposed to be there from board to board to board. It's, we may amend the bylaws from time to time, but the bylaws is your governing document. So that, of course, if you want a bylaws committee and you want it to be a standing committee, it would be in the bylaws so that people have to abide by the bylaws, or they're supposed to abide by the bylaws. But what we saw a couple of years ago or a year ago was that from time to time, people don't abide by the bylaws. People on the board don't abide by the bylaws. And it was interesting that someone said, but we have a lawyer. We have a lawyer present who knows bylaws, and that lawyer somehow, for a friend of mine, a guy I have great respect for, but he didn't do very much in order to save us from a serious problem. Had there been a bylaws committee at that time that was functioning and that was meaningful, I don't think that the board would have done what it did. That board.
So you're relating to past experiences too, so that's important.
Past experiences, that's right.
I think to Leslie's question though, yes, this would be language within the bylaws, but other committees, because they're standing committees and they're ad hoc committees that each board determines it needs. And in fact, this board determined, hey, we went with some of the committees that have existed in the past, and like lakes, for example, those are sort of obvious and living committees. But there are others that we sort of wanted to consolidate. Those can look different, and I think that that's what the committee's provision of the bylaws is really meant to provide that flexibility for. So if we don't want to build all of those in necessarily, but this is sort of
well, the most important ones.
Right, but the point of this is that we don't want to. This necessarily won't necessarily be replicated for each and every other committee. In answer to your question, though.
Scott had his hand raised.
Just
Scott,
one thought,
yeah,
and
sorry.
Patrick, I think you alluded to this earlier. This concept, and obviously there are things specific to the bylaws committee within this paragraph or this document, but maybe it's appropriate to amend the bylaws so that certain committees have to have a structure like this where there will be continuity. Maybe the finance committee should have something like that. I think that's possibly more important than the bylaws committee on a certain level. Obviously the bylaws committee, I can't really think of any other committee at the moment where I feel that continuity is really crucial.
Can I chime in real quick,
Yeah,
Patrick?
go ahead, Earl.
I think Scott read my mind. Here go the reason why I did mention the finance committee, because yes, bylaws committee is important. I get it. But finance committee helps provide governance and support to agnostic of Dan being the treasurer, anyone who's managing the finance. I think my only question to Robert and whomever else is going to guide driving this document is, this is key, but I also think there needs to be some type of morality clause that's tied to this, because this is different. Because one of the things I noticed, and maybe I lost context, is that the non-board member cannot be removed by the president or by the board. I mean, we as board members, we have to hold ourselves to a higher, I don't know, responsibility, a higher level of behavior. Here, we all had to sign a morality document and agree to behave and interact in a certain way as representatives. I think this committee, if it is to be formed in the way it is and have a different type of tenant, then it needs to have some type of governance around that as well.
And when I was before in the on the board years ago, we had a code of conduct. Every board member had to sign. I can send, you know, the copies that I still have, so you guys can take a look at it and see if it could be modified to, you know, to 2023 or whatever.
We're actually working on
Just
that.
to have a code of
Leslie, we're actually
conduct.
working on the revised code of conduct that it
Okay, okay, all right, good.
Native enough.
So,
And other corporate governance documents, but to Earl's point, there, and I don't want to take away from your point that maybe this needs some language around, okay, how do we prevent this from becoming cabal or something? But there are good measures of corporate governance that we might consider on this.
Just a quick question, Bob. You mentioned earlier that if we had a good functioning bylaws committee, it could have prevented possibly some breach of the bylaws that occurred a year or two ago.
Which is a
Right.
governance issue.
If you really feel that way, I think something else has to be added to this to give us some power, some authority to review things, because I don't think if this committee was there or not, we would have been privy to a lot of things that were going on that would have enabled us to really protect the community.
And wouldn't have had the power to do anything about it. Agree with you.
So-
you had no authority.
Not a governance, it's not a governance committee.
Yeah, the only thing that it says is that the committee is charged with interpreting the bylaws for the board. Now, in the event that the committee interpreted the bylaws for the board and said, you can't do this under the bylaws, and the board said, we're going to do it anyway, I think the only thing that the committee could do, and maybe should be able to do, is communicate with the membership to let the membership know that the board is acting ultra vires, so to speak. They're acting beyond their authority, beyond what we believe their authority to be. But this committee doesn't have any power to do anything. I also would question, other than advise the board. If the board doesn't want to take the advice of the committee, then that's on the board. That's not, the committee doesn't have the power to do anything about it. So far as a morality clause is concerned or something, I'm not sure what you want from the members of the committee other than their opinions. And I don't think you want to say that if somebody doesn't share your opinions, they could be removed from the board. I'm sure that we wouldn't want to say that or do that. Not this group, and not any group should want to do that. So what else? Every board member, every member of the committee should be a member in good standing. And I think that the bylaws already say something about that, that committee people, if you're going to be on a committee, you have to be a member in good standing. If, you know, if you're not paying your dues, maybe you shouldn't be able to be on the committee either. But other than that, why would you be removing anybody because of what they believe? I mean, I guess you could ask them to leave if they don't come to the meetings and they don't participate. That if you wanted to put that in and say, you know, if somebody is just, you know, calls him or herself a member of the committee but doesn't participate, that person should resign, or if you wanted to do that. I didn't think it was necessary to do that, but if you wanted that, we could do that.
That would
But I
probably
see a morale.
be a vote by the committee, though. At that point, the majority would rule maybe to vote to.
Yeah, but because of the fact that you're just talking about opinions, if somebody has an opinion that everybody else on the committee disagrees with, I don't think that's a good reason to remove the person.
Absolutely.
I need to come back and ask a more fundamental question now, as Robert, as I heard you walk through that explanation. And what I'm thinking the solution is to move in that first paragraph after "from time to time," move comma "at the request of the board or at the committee's own initiative," comma, and move that up to before the first little I there. I'm worried that there's a situation where this becomes a second guessing committee. And I think that's a problem from a number of perspectives. It would have been potentially helpful in recent events, but I think it becomes both a problem from just a functioning governance standpoint, and maybe a political standpoint, but also a potential liability standpoint if we have a committee where a bylaws committee where, quote, interpreting the bylaws for the board can be read as giving advice to the board on whether what it's doing is correct or not correct under the bylaws. I think that's a big power we don't need to assign out elsewhere. I think there are legal fiduciary duties that board members have and that the board has collectively that needs to stay with the board. I think it's fraught with disaster if we try to, if anyone could make the argument that phrase is read out as somehow policing the correctness of a board's decision. Does that make sense?
I hear what you're saying, except for the fact that what I understood happened, and I wasn't there, I wasn't part of the board, nor was I advising anybody during that period of time. But what I understood happened was there was an outright decision that was made to do things even though you couldn't do them under the bylaws. And I remember some years ago, quite a number of years ago, when I was on the bylaws committee, somebody had asked the question about, well, supposing there's this emergency and we just have to do this, you know, we have to make this repair, and we don't have authority under the bylaws to do it. And I think it was even Ken Herfield who asked that question. But I remember the answer that was given by the bylaws committee at that time. And the answer was, you know, you do what you have to do, and then you'll deal with it later. You know, if there's going to be a collapse of a building or something like that, and you've got to act, you just act. Come on, you know, guys, take it, you know, understand that you have to do that. We are all members of this community, whether we are professionals or not. We're trying to discharge a responsibility on the bylaws committee to properly interpret the bylaws for the governing body, which is the board. And to the extent that they come to us, and the old bylaws committee they used to come to us. They used to come to the committee and ask, what about this? What does this mean? Do we need to change the bylaw in order to do this? How can we change the bylaw to do it. That's what the bylaws committee did then. And that's what the bylaws committee should be doing now, I think.
I don't know that I agree, respectfully. I think that's potentially problematic for a board to put that on a committee of, yeah, I gotta think that one through.
Do you think the board, Patrick, do you think the board as a board
Yeah,
would be more qualified to interpret the bylaws than a
yes,
bylaws committee?
yes.
That
I think they
yes,
have to. I think they have a fiduciary duty to. And I think whether they can rely on the advice of counsel, but I don't think they're saved by relying on the interpretation of some committee necessarily.
Even if the bylaws, Patrick, even if the bylaws provide for that?
Well, plus the board members are also the ones that are elected. So, I mean,
yeah, but you may
Well,
remember.
I think if the bylaws provide for that, though, Scott, I think then that shifts that responsibility off impermissibly to unelected non-fiduciaries. I don't know. I'm not trying to overthink it, but
It's always on the board. It's not on the committee, it's on the board. But remember the question that was posed to our council. Who do you work for? Do you work for the community or do you work for the board? And the answer was pretty clear. Work for the board. Now, the bylaws committee are community members. They don't work for they advise the board, but they are not servants of the board where I want you to do this. I want you to do that. I don't want you to write it that way. It's very clear that if the board doesn't agree with if the board doesn't agree with a recommendation of the bylaws committee under the way it's written now, any member of the bylaws committee can go to the community and say, hey, the bylaws committee wanted it this way, or a group from the bylaws committee wanted it this way. And we would recommend that you not vote the way the board is asking you to vote. The reason that that's in there is to protect against a runaway board, a board that wants to take control, wants to do things that are not consistent with the bylaws, and the bylaws committee would be some kind of a check on it. If you don't want there to be a check on that, well, I think that's a problem.
but it's not about removing the check. The bylaws in itself would have to be voted on, and the people that are represented of the community are elected. So, not trying to minimize, what the committee does. I'm just saying that at that point, the ones holding the torch here would have to be the elected ones because they're the ones that are liable, and they're the ones that were assigned the position by the community.
Well, I
sorry,
think,
I don't want to run over that for a moment, Dan. And Jeff, I see your hand up, and I know others want to chime in. But Robert, I don't want to lose that last point. I'm all for checks and balances, but I think it's got to be at the board's request as to whether there is some action of the board that there's an interpretation of whether it is or is not within the bylaws, because otherwise there's the risk that there's a committee of unelected folks who are can, for whatever reason, decide, hey, you know what, we don't like what you're doing there. We're going to second guess it. And we've interpreted that you are violating the bylaws. And then we've set up this thing. And I want to avoid those kinds of crazy scenarios if we can. And I'm worried that as drafted, that with the intent being that that's a check and balance on the board's interpretation, which it should, the board members should be able to interpret the bylaws, should be able to read and interpret them on their own. It'd be nice to ask for help if needed and have that help there. And maybe that's what the intent of the bylaws committee is for. But to have it be required or otherwise be usurped by a committee, I think is a big problem.
Yep.
The committee doesn't know what the board is doing unless the board tells the committee what they're doing. So to the extent that the committee decides that they want to do something without going to the bylaws committee, and they just say they're going to do it, then they're going to do it. I don't know how the bylaws committee finds out unless the board asks them, because it says interpreting the bylaws for the board.
Yeah, but the whole tone of this
Jeff has
stuff,
had a hand up.
I think it just kind of shifted downward. But I think Jeff has his hand up. Patrick's fair on that.
Yeah.
Our tone is shifted.
I know I'm overthinking it. I know I'm being overly analytical, but I am trying to think of, like with anything, like what are the permutations and what are the potential scenarios under which that language can play out. We're living in hypotheticals at the moment. I know we're all trying to proceed with the purest of intentions, but I'm worried about that language a little bit. Anyway, Jeff, please, you've patiently had your hand.
All right, here's my question to Robert. Basically, this is going to be a committee that we're going to interpret and advise the board, but what could we have done as a committee that would have prevented what happened with our big financial disaster? What, like, obviously you guys have executive sessions and things are done in executive session and people aren't privy to executive session. We don't know what happened. Obviously, when they did the financials and decided that they were going to, I guess, spend more than what would be a required vote by the community, it must have been done in executive session. Somebody
Couldn't have been, nor is that permissible.
Yeah, I mean, it had to be done
Session is
somewhere.
legal and personnel. That's it.
Yeah, I mean,
That's right.
So,
Well, but that's right.
Somebody violated their fiduciary, responsibilities, and we're paying
If in fact those were carried out in executive session.
Yeah, I don't know, but what could, if we were a committee, we're a committee, we're not allowed to be in executive session. We're not there with, you guys are elected. We're just an advisory committee. So what could have this had changed?
Absolutely.
But Jeff, I think that what might have happened is that not every member of that old board was on board with what was going on.
I agree.
And members of the board would have had at least some group to go to that might have come up with something that could have perhaps turned the tide. I do not know, but I know there wasn't anything to go to, and what it resulted in was resignations, and it was terrible. And then there was the operation of a board with just like 4 people, or 3, and 2 people represented a majority. I mean, that wasn't working very well. So I would think that there would have been a way. I don't know. As I said, I wasn't there, but as Yakov said, this bylaws committee is not designed to hurt the board. It's designed to help the board. It's designed to protect the board from doing things that might sound good but don't really work, because they're violative of something that might get the board into some hot water. So that's all it is. I mean, it's not a nefarious organization, the bylaws.
If I could just jump in for a second, Jeff, just to try to answer, your question, which I think is a very good one. Let's go and to follow up a little bit on what Bob is saying. Let's go back to that scenario that you asked about. So, and imagine that you're sitting on the board and some person on the board says, look, we're going to go and we're going to expend these monies. And you're going to look and you're going to say, well, wait a second, we don't have the necessary, we're required to obtain community approval for this, it seems, under the bylaws and so forth. And let's say that I'm a board member and I'm pushing and saying, no, let's go forward. I just want to do this. And what this would do is this would give you, if you will, an intermediate step. And you could say, well, we have a committee, we have a standing committee that is set up of people who spend a lot of time reading bylaws and everything like that. rather than us making a decision and potentially being subject to legal liability where somebody's going to run to court and sue us for doing this, why don't we protect ourselves by just going to this committee and, and asking them to sit and give us their view as to whether what we're proposing to do works. And so you now have an interim, you have an arm of the board that is basically set aside for doing that, so that rather than just, willy-nilly making decisions, there are, you have got legal and other experienced people who would basically hear what the board is proposing and then say, well, yeah, and asking whether this is consistent with the bylaws or not. And they'd say, in our view, it is, or in our view, it isn't. And it would therefore provide that level of protection for the board. And it would have maybe given somebody on the board the ability to speak up and say, well, why don't we, instead of saying you can't do this, instead saying, well, why don't we ask these people whether they agree that we can do this? So I think that's really what it's meant to. And I mean, I'll give you another example. This goes back 2 years. And there's a provision, if you look in your bylaws, there's a provision in Article 3, Section 1 about the timing of when elections are supposed to be held. And it says here that there shall be an annual meeting of the members to be held on a weekend morning between August 15th and Labor Day each year. And the board wanted, without a bylaw amendment, to go and to basically postpone the meeting and to have the meeting be held at a different time. And the question was, are they allowed to do that? And frankly, it was only because Michael basically said, spoke up and said, look, I'm reading this thing and it's just, that's not what it says. It says there shall be a meeting at this time. I don't see how we have the right to just go ahead and do that and delay it. But for that, I think the board was potentially ready to go and to propose delaying the meeting. And I got to tell you, that would have ended up resulting in a lawsuit, which is not something which is good for the community. So that's what this committee, in my view, at least the way I was thinking about it, that's what this committee is formed for. It's formed to be an advisory branch for the board, so that when difficult questions like this come up, rather than them making a decision on their own, which could be viewed as being a political decision, they could cover themselves with a line of defense by getting this advice.
So Jakob, I really appreciate that explanation. And I guess I think both of those examples you cited presuppose that the board is asking for that interpretation and asking for that help. And where my concern comes from in the way that that first paragraph is currently worded, unless we move at the board's request piece up a little bit, is that there is a scenario, and I'll give you a real life example. There is a scenario where a collection of folks who may, sit on the bylaws committee say, hey, we don't think what you did is in keeping with the bylaws, board. We are going to challenge that. We have interpreted it differently. And here's why. So I appreciate the protection point. I think that's important, but I'm worried about it being used as a cudgel later on to try to second guess a board's decision. So in other words, if the bylaws committee isn't being asked for that interpretation, what is to stop the bylaws committee under this language from unilaterally, for political reasons or otherwise, offering its own interpretation, which I think is fraught with disaster?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I would just, and maybe we can make it clear in the language, but I think I think we try to address that in the language. If you look in item 1 in the first paragraph, the committee is charged with interpreting the bylaws for the board. In other words, that's something which comes where the board is asking for an interpretation. The issue about proposing potential revisions to the bylaws, that's something where the committee could basically come to the board and say, hey, we've been thinking about the bylaws, you may want to change this proposal. We can't enforce it. I mean, the committee can't force the board to do it. The board ultimately controls whether they do or don't want to take it to the community. But as far as advising the board, as far as the interpretation, that's being done for the board, meaning at the request of the board. And we can make that language clearer if you'd like.
Yeah, maybe change the word for to at the request of, or.
Yeah, I mean, that language could be clarified. I understand that.
And I was gonna say, regarding interpretation, that is such a I can interpret something in my way, you will interpret it in a different way. But like Yakov said, when Michael says, no, the bylaws here says we have to have the meeting on this date, it was clear enough. So whatever revisions has to be done, there can't be so much room for interpretation. It is black or white, not like I will take it this way and the other board member would take it a different way. It has to be clear enough. And like I said, like Yakov said, Michael brought that, this is the section, it says it's supposed to be the annual meeting at this time, and there was no room for misinterpretation. So that interpretation there, I'm having a little issue there to put the word there because, you know, like I said, you'll understand it one way and I'll understand it a different way.
I just want to just say something, you know, looking back at, you know, all the expenditures, you know, for the entertainium, for the pool, when we went to this project, we didn't, you know, realize the headwinds, that financial headwinds, inflationary, you know, inflation that we haven't seen since the 70s, basically, and supplies doubling, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think there was any nefarious reasons that this happened. I think this was just a circumstance, you know, that you could see coming. You know, this summer before this blew up, I even said to Michael, I said, we got to be so over budget. Materials have doubled, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But going ahead, if we're going to do any big projects in Emerald Green again, like, you know, maybe the green space, the golf course or something that we're going to spend, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, we have to really have our P's and Q's ahead of time and really have it nailed down. So this doesn't happen again. This cannot happen again.
And
Basically.
Jeff, to that point, and I know Dan has raised this in the past, that we can tighten language, whether it's through the bylaws or through our own board corporate governance documents, to set those controls around that. And I do think that's very important. But I don't think there's anything in the bylaws as they're written now, unless it's literally someone said, I don't think we can do this, let's do it anyway, which may have happened. I don't know. I just don't know. That would have prevented what happened last year. And
We just would have had to stop the project. I mean, that would have been it. I mean, if it would have came down to it, that's probably why.
I don't think there's any committee or any, you know, other than a lawyer saying, yeah, I don't think, you know, and again, the question has to be asked, can we do this? And the lawyer would have to say no, but I don't know that that occurred or didn't occur. I'm not suggesting one way or another. I'm just saying, I'm not sure that this amendment would have prevented what happened then, nor would it prevent that in the future. I'm not sure that there's anything other than good corporate governance, good fiduciary duty following.
Yeah, we have an account that we keep adding to, you know, which we have a reserve account, but we might have to make a much bigger reserve account to pay for projects. So we're basically paid for before we begin, if there's a way.
But if people spend beyond what they're permitted to do, what their authority level is, there are laws and consequences around that don't live within the bylaws.
Yeah, so my thought was, you know, to task the bylaws committee with challenging the board on specific projects. Let's just say we had $1 million project, and the bylaws committee would create a framework of follow-up on funds for that specific project over a period of time, to ensure that the board is doing its duty and staying on task with the funds available. So there was there's a whole draft framework that I've had kicking around that would help some of those issues, but in the thought process of time here, I don't know that this specific document would help that at all.
And the other thing is that from finance, the bylaws committee would have minimal, if any, type of influence on finance in any decisions that are made when it comes down to the spending on behalf of the board. At best, it would be the finance committee that would have some type of posturing that would say, hey, Dan, Dean, whomever's on the board, I see you all are spending $1 million. Help me understand why. Let's go through those numbers. That's the finance committee's responsibility, not bylaws committee's responsibility.
I think this is where you have that classic sort of overlap. And what I heard Dan suggesting is really better internal controls around
Yep.
How spending decisions are made, and you may get authorization from the community to do a project for $1 million. Well, how do you spend that million? And what happens if you have change orders, that sort of thing? That's all good corporate governance that the board can deal with rules wise. And I hear Dan's point about that. I think those things can be better made. And project management, who has those responsibilities. I don't think everything like that has to be spelled out in bylaws.
Yeah, so
I realize we're getting late on time. Sorry, Dan, to cut you off. Scott, I'm going to let you ask your question, then I'm going to give a suggestion on how we proceed here.
So
get a quick update so we can wrap up.
Patrick, I was about to say I actually have a 5:30 meeting that I'm going to have to be heading out soon. I think it would be a good idea if we could maybe pick a couple of ideas to work on and divvy them up. Two thoughts. I think Yakov had mentioned in the past about maybe setting something up on voting structure, on e-voting, in-person voting if we want to do something. And the other thought that I had, which we also discussed, is to tighten up what it means to be in good standing to vote, because we've had people who got knocked out in ways that I think were unfair, and I think we should work on those two issues.
Thanks. I want to come. Let's put a pin in that for just a hot second. In terms of moving this forward, Robert and others, Yakov, Scott, I think you've heard a lot of the concerns, and I'm happy to work with you guys in redlining some suggested changes to this document. This is a great start. I wouldn't throw this out. I would just sort of fix a couple little things to try to address the concerns that we talked about this afternoon. And if that's okay, that's how I propose that we move this piece forward, because I think it's a really worthwhile piece of work product, and we should try to carry it forward. Okay. Scott, to the other point, and this transitions to item 2 on our agenda. I had a couple of to-dos, which I'll just be honest, the holidays got the better of me and vacation got the better of me, and I have not put together anything for everyone's consideration. I was going to look at partly the e-voting structure, and Yakov, I'm happy to work with you if you're interested in that. There's a sort of a disagreement as to whether electronic voting is currently allowed in the bylaws or not. Seems that it may be. I think that language.
I don't think it is.
Up. But either way,
Patrick, that would be because of Article 9 language.
Yeah, I don't
think that's adequate. Personally,
yeah, I think it could be made better. But in addition, I think the bigger point is, well, okay, procedurally, how do you carry that out? You need a vendor to do it. You have to have some rules around it. You have to make sure there's integrity and protections. That's really, to me, the sort of bigger nugget, and something that we need to work on, and that will include visiting with a vendor, because I use OPA and other stuff in non-formal contexts, political contexts, but I think we need something a little bit not super costly, but not informal either. So I'm going to keep working on that. Anything else folks want to raise? Respecting everybody's time. It's
this one thing. If we do electronic voting, how is the company and our office going to work together, knowing who could vote and who cannot, according to like their financial standing? How do you shut them off or turn them on?
Yeah, I don't know.
Really important. That's going to be super important.
Yeah. All the devil is in the details, as they say, and to Scott's point too, I think there's an ongoing conversation that we need to solve quickly about what it means to be a member of good standing, and really how to make sure we're enforcing that rule fairly, so that people are able to participate. Our goal is not to exclude people, it's to include people. So we need to figure out how we can do that. All right. Thanks everybody for I'm gonna stop the share here so I can see a little bit more of everyone's face. For hanging in there and being a part of this. So if nobody has anything else, if we know what we need to do, and we'll see everybody on the second Tuesday, whatever it is of next month.
Great.
Thanks,
Okay.
guys.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye.